Russia's war in Ukraine entered another critical phase on June 29, 2026, when the Kremlin made clear that Moscow's conditions for ending the war had not changed, and President Vladimir Putin rejected what he described as a Ukrainian proposal to halt long-range strikes. That combination mattered immediately because it linked the latest diplomatic signals directly to the ongoing air war, the pressure on Russian energy infrastructure, and the continuing danger to Ukrainian cities. This was not just another statement from Moscow, it was a statement tied to battlefield momentum, drone warfare, fuel shortages inside Russia, territorial demands, and the wider question of whether any serious path to de-escalation still exists. The issue was not simply that negotiations were stalled. The issue was that one of the few measures that might have reduced the scale of long-range attacks was publicly dismissed while both sides continued to use those attacks as tools of pressure. The clearest public signal came through a Kremlin message reported on the same day. Reuters reported that the Kremlin said Russia's stance on the conditions for a Ukraine peace deal had not changed since 2024. That sentence alone carried major implications because the conditions Moscow outlined in 2024 were already severe. According to that framework, Ukraine would have to withdraw its forces from the 4 regions that Russia says are part of its territory, and Kiev would also have to abandon its plans to join NATO. Those demands were already central obstacles to any settlement, and by saying that Russia's position had not changed, the Kremlin effectively signaled that its baseline remained as hard as before. That meant the day's diplomatic message was not about flexibility, it was about continuity. At nearly the same time, another line of reporting added a more specific and more dramatic detail. Putin said Kiev had proposed a mutual halt to long-range strikes and that fighting should be confined to the 4 regions: Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia. This detail, reported by Al Jazeera, immediately raised the stakes because it touched the exact category of attacks that has come to define the war's latest phase. Long-range strikes now shape not only military outcomes, but political messaging, domestic morale, infrastructure security, and public perceptions of who is under pressure. A proposal to halt such strikes, if accepted, would have affected attacks on Russian oil refineries, drone operations deep inside Russian territory, and Russian missile and drone attacks on cities across Ukraine. By rejecting it, Putin did not merely dismiss a narrow military suggestion. He preserved one of the war's most consequential tools of escalation. The wording of Putin's position matters in full, because it explains the logic behind his refusal. It is clear why this proposal is being made because our counterstrikes deep into Ukrainian territory are much stronger, have greater impact, and are, frankly, more destructive, Putin said. He then added another line that carried a blunt political message. Given their catastrophic shortage of personnel, the Ukrainian armed forces apparently believe this could be their salvation, but saving the Kiev regime is not part of our plans. These quotations, reported by Al Jazeera, show that Putin presented the issue not as a reciprocal security measure, but as a Ukrainian request driven by battlefield weakness. In his framing, halting long-range strikes would reduce pressure on Ukraine more than on Russia. That is why his rejection was not tactical ambiguity. It was a declaration that Russia still sees military coercion through long-range attacks as strategically useful. That argument needs to be understood in the context of what long-range strikes have been doing to Russia in recent weeks. AP reported that a marked shift had taken place in the war as Ukraine's expanding drone strikes brought fuel shortages in Russia and in Russia-occupied territory. According to that reporting, the attacks weakened Russian military supply lines to the front in eastern and southern Ukraine and slowed Russian advances. In other words, Ukraine's deep strike campaign was not symbolic. It had measurable logistical consequences. That helps explain why the topic of long-range strikes became politically central. If Ukrainian drones can reach Russian oil infrastructure, cause shortages, and generate domestic frustration inside Russia, then any proposal to restrict long-range attacks would directly affect one of Kiev's most effective instruments of pressure. The same AP report added another key detail. Russian President Vladimir Putin on Sunday acknowledged that Ukrainian long-range drone strikes on Russia's oil facilities have caused fuel shortages. That acknowledgement matters because it confirms that the issue was not only visible to outside analysts, it was visible to the Russian leadership and to Russian citizens waiting in long lines at gas stations. AP said the scarcity had triggered public anger and frustration. So when Putin rejected a halt to long-range strikes, he did so even while publicly recognizing that Ukraine's attacks had created real discomfort and disruption inside Russia. That tells us something important about Moscow's priorities. The Kremlin appears willing to absorb domestic economic and political pressure if it believes its own long-range attack capabilities still provide greater leverage over Ukraine. Another important element in the reporting is that Putin's rejection did not happen in isolation from broader statements about the war's future. AP reported that he ruled out making concessions to end the invasion and insisted that Russia would ultimately prevail despite what he called temporary setbacks. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov then reinforced the message. Their effort makes us confident that our goals will be achieved, Peskov told reporters. That line matters because it shows that the Kremlin's public posture on the same day combined 3 linked positions: no change in core peace conditions, no acceptance of limits on long-range strikes, and continued confidence in eventual Russian success. For anyone trying to measure whether Moscow is moving toward compromise, that combination pointed in the opposite direction. The context of the battlefield is also central to understanding why this topic has strong narrative power. On the same weekend, Ukraine continued to intensify its own long-range campaign. Al Jazeera reported that President Volodymyr Zelenskyy said Ukrainian forces hit the Slavyansk and Yaroslavl oil refineries in Russia overnight with long-range drones, roughly 300 kilometers and 700 kilometers from the front line. The governor of Russia's Krasnodar region reported that a fire broke out at the refinery in Slavyansk na Kubani, and several houses were damaged by debris. One person was reported killed in the region east of Russian-occupied Crimea. These details matter because they show that long-range strikes are no longer occasional interruptions. They are part of a sustained operational pattern aimed at energy nodes, logistics, and supply capacity. Zelenskyy's wording also highlighted the strategic logic behind those attacks. "We continue our operations that weaken Russia's ability to wage this war," Zelenskyy wrote on X on Sunday, adding that each attack means fewer resources serving Russia's war machine. That sentence is critical because it defines the Ukrainian rationale in direct operational terms. Ukraine is not presenting deep strikes as symbolic revenge. It is presenting them as resource denial. From Kiev's perspective, every refinery fire, power disruption, or logistics bottleneck reduces the fuel, transport, and military support available to Russian forces. That is exactly why a mutual halt on long-range strikes would matter so much. It would not only change the violence profile of the war, it would directly affect one of the methods Ukraine believes is constraining Russia's ability to continue fighting. The Kremlin, however, presented a different view of the same issue. "All the strikes, wherever they hit our infrastructure, absolutely do not affect the situation on the front, on the line of combat contact," Putin said. He then added another explanation. "They are attempting to disrupt energy supplies and impact the tourism season, intentions they have openly communicated to us through various channels." These quotations, reported by Al Jazeera, show that Putin publicly minimized the battlefield impact of Ukrainian strikes while acknowledging their effects on energy and civilian economic life. The distinction matters. Moscow appears to be saying that even if the strikes are disruptive, they do not justify any major strategic concession, because they do not alter the decisive military balance at the front. Whether outside analysts agree with that assessment is a separate question. The political meaning of the statement is that Russia does not see current damage levels as sufficient reason to give up a form of warfare it still considers advantageous. The role of oil infrastructure in this dispute cannot be overstated. Al Jazeera reported that Ukraine's attacks on Russian refineries are the latest in a campaign against Russian energy sites that has gathered pace in recent weeks. It noted that Ukraine used long-range drones to hit 2 oil facilities in Kerch in Crimea and Port Kavkaz in Krasnodar, both of which are used to bring fuel to Russian front lines. It also reported strikes on electricity plants that prompted the suspension of fuel sales in Crimea. This matters because it connects deep strikes to logistics in a very direct way. If fuel movement into occupied and operational areas is disrupted, then the consequences are military as well as economic. That is one reason Putin's rejection of a halt on long-range strikes is such an important development. He is choosing to keep active a domain of warfare that increasingly touches Russia's own energy arteries. The question of why Putin rejected the proposal also drew analytical response. Al Jazeera cited Ian Lesser, a distinguished fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, who said Russia has a significantly greater capacity for long-range attacks, and therefore would naturally want to preserve that edge rather than compromise on it. Moscow will surely see its own long-range strike capability as a deterrent, perhaps all the more significant for him, Putin, as Ukraine expands its own ability to attack targets in Russia at longer range. Lesser added, that explanation is valuable because it frames the issue in strategic balance terms, rather than purely political rhetoric. If one side believes it has a stronger long-range arsenal, it has little incentive to agree to mutual restraint unless the costs of continuing become too high. That asymmetry helps explain why Putin's rejection matters so much for future escalation. If Russia sees its long-range strike capability as both a coercive instrument and a deterrent, then attacks on cities, infrastructure, and rear areas remain central to its theory of pressure. If Ukraine sees its own long-range strikes as a way to reduce resources feeding the Russian war machine, then neither side has much incentive to stop first. That is the deeper logic behind the story. The debate is not simply over whether strikes are morally defensible or politically costly. It is over whether each side believes long-range attacks are helping it get closer to strategic objectives. Right now, both appear to believe the answer is yes. The diplomatic dimension becomes even more striking when placed next to the broader state of peace efforts. Al Jazeera reported that truce talks have largely stalled because of Russia's insistence on retaining territory it has seized in Ukraine, while Ukraine has stated that it is not prepared to cede any territory. That means the dispute over long-range strikes is layered on top of a more basic dispute over sovereignty and territorial control. Even if both sides somehow agreed to limit drone or missile strikes, the war would still confront the unresolved issue of the 4 regions Russia claims and Ukraine refuses to surrender. That is why the current argument over strike limits is important but not sufficient. It sits inside a much deeper deadlock. The same report also noted that Putin had given mixed messages about when or with whom he might resume talks. On one hand, he said Moscow was ready to renew negotiations. On the other hand, he tied those negotiations to terms proposed in Istanbul in 2022, including Russia's demand that Ukraine surrender the eastern region of Donbas, which remains largely under Russian occupation. That matters because it means Moscow can publicly present itself as open to talks while still insisting on conditions Ukraine is highly unlikely to accept. In that environment, rejecting a halt to long-range strikes becomes even more significant. It signals that even limited confidence-building measures are not gaining traction, let alone a comprehensive settlement. The political symbolism of the issue also extends beyond Russia and Ukraine. Since U.S. President Donald Trump returned to office in January 2025, he has said he wants to end Russia's war in Ukraine. Al Jazeera reported that he met both Putin and Zelenskyy separately to discuss ending the war, but those efforts did not produce a settlement. It also reported that in recent days, Putin expected a resumption of Washington-led diplomatic efforts once the hot phase of the U.S.-Israel war on Iran was resolved. This wider setting matters because it shows how Ukraine diplomacy is competing for attention in a crowded international crisis environment. Putin may calculate that under such conditions, pressure through continued war and continued strikes will yield more than compromise. Another part of the story is that Ukraine's proposal, as described by Putin, would have confined fighting to Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia. That detail is significant because it suggests a narrower war zone and a reduction in pressure on rear cities and energy systems. Yet from Moscow's perspective, such a change would also reduce Russia's ability to use long-range attacks as leverage. If Russian missiles and drones can no longer reach targets deep inside Ukraine, then one of the Kremlin's tools for exerting psychological and strategic pressure is diminished. Putin's public dismissal of the idea indicates that Moscow still values the freedom to strike beyond the immediate front. In military terms, that freedom means cities, infrastructure, logistics hubs, and energy systems all remain exposed. The Ukrainian side has its own reasons for resisting any arrangement that freezes current territorial dynamics while preserving Russian claims. Ukraine has repeatedly argued that giving up territory under pressure would reward aggression and create conditions for future coercion. That position makes any compromise extremely difficult, especially when the Kremlin continues to insist on withdrawal from 4 regions and a reversal of Ukraine's NATO course. As a result, even a limited proposal such as halting long-range strikes becomes tangled in larger fears. Kiev may want to reduce attacks on cities while still keeping pressure on Russian infrastructure. Moscow may want to keep its long-range advantage while forcing Ukraine into territorial concessions. The gap between those aims is precisely why this topic resonates. Military geography also matters here. Russia's claimed regions are not abstract bargaining chips. Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia are territories through which supply routes, river crossings, industrial assets, and population centers all run. If fighting were restricted to those regions, other parts of Ukraine might receive relief from long-range attacks, but the battle for those territories would remain intense. Putin's rejection, therefore, did not simply preserve attacks on rear areas. It also preserved the option of using long-range weapons to shape the broader war while Russian troops continue frontline offensives. In that sense, he kept open both layers of pressure at once: ground action in contested regions and deep strikes beyond them. The Russian domestic angle adds another reason why the story is compelling. When Putin admitted that Ukrainian attacks had caused fuel shortages, he effectively confirmed that the war is no longer something the Russian population can imagine as distant from daily life. Fuel queues, public frustration, and refinery fires are visible forms of disruption. Yet he still refused to trade away Russia's long-range strike campaign in exchange for mutual restraint. That sends a clear signal to Russian audiences as well. The Kremlin is asking its own citizens to absorb inconvenience and uncertainty, while the military continues operations it considers strategically necessary. The choice suggests a regime willing to prioritize coercive leverage over short-term domestic comfort. The Ukrainian domestic angle is even more immediate because long-range Russian strikes continue to kill civilians and damage infrastructure. On the same day this diplomatic debate unfolded, AP reported that Russian missiles and drones killed at least 11 civilians and injured 40 others in Ukraine, while Al Jazeera and the Kyiv Independent documented additional and updated casualties in Dnipro, Zaporizhzhia, Sumy, Kharkiv, Chernihiv, Donetsk, and Kherson. This matters because the argument over long-range strikes is not theoretical. The costs are visible in casualty lists, damaged homes, power cuts, and urban fear. When Putin rejects a halt, Ukrainians hear not only a geopolitical statement, but a signal that the attacks threatening rear cities are not likely to stop soon. There is also a strong credibility dynamic in how this story is told on video. It has a clear top line: Putin rejected limits on long-range strikes. It has a concrete reason. Moscow believes its own deep strike capability is stronger and more useful. It has visible context. Ukraine has been hitting Russian oil refineries and fuel systems. It has human consequences. Russian strikes continue to kill civilians across Ukraine, and it has unresolved diplomatic meaning. The Kremlin says its peace conditions remain unchanged since 2024. A topic with that structure naturally supports a long, fact-based narrative because each layer reinforces the next. The story can move from statement to reason to battlefield context to energy pressure to diplomacy to consequences without losing coherence. The role of language in the Kremlin's messaging also deserves attention. Putin did not simply say the proposal was unacceptable. He said Ukrainian forces had a catastrophic shortage of personnel and that limiting long-range attacks could be their salvation. That framing seeks to present Ukraine as strategically weak and Russia as under no obligation to relieve pressure. The phrase "saving the Kiev regime is not part of our plans" pushes the message even further. It moves from military assessment into overt political hostility. This is not the language of a leader preparing publics for compromise. It is the language of a leader explaining why continued coercion remains necessary. That matters because rhetoric often signals intent as clearly as force posture does. The same is true of the Kremlin's public insistence that Russia's goals will still be achieved. If officials say their military effort is moving in a direction that makes success plausible, they are less likely to endorse partial restraint that reduces options. Even if the battlefield is more complicated than those statements suggest, the political effect is the same. The leadership is telling domestic and international audiences that it does not believe the cost-benefit balance has shifted enough to warrant a softer line. That is one reason the rejection of a halt on long-range strikes reads as a strong signal rather than a passing comment. It fits into a consistent public narrative of endurance, advantage, and unwillingness to compromise under current conditions. Another feature of the story is the strategic value of uncertainty. By keeping long-range strikes in play, Russia preserves ambiguity about what targets may be hit next and where Ukraine must allocate defensive systems. That ambiguity itself is useful. It forces Ukraine to spread air defenses, protect infrastructure in depth, and plan for repeated attacks on cities far from the front. Ukraine uses ambiguity in its own way as well, by hitting refineries and infrastructure nodes deep inside Russia, showing that distance alone does not guarantee safety. A mutual halt would reduce that mutual uncertainty. Putin's rejection ensures it remains a tool in the contest. That is why the decision matters even beyond any one strike. The energy dimension is especially powerful because it ties warfare to economics in a visible way. Oil refineries are not only industrial facilities, they are sources of fuel for military movement, civilian transport, and national revenue. When Ukraine strikes them, it hits both logistics and domestic confidence. When Putin refuses to halt long-range strikes, he is effectively saying that Russia will continue to absorb those risks, while preserving its own right to strike deep into Ukraine. That calculation suggests the Kremlin believes its overall strategic position remains stronger than the disruption caused by refinery attacks. Whether that belief holds over time is a different question. What matters now is that the current policy is one of persistence, not reduction. There is also a timing question built into the story. Why reject this now when refinery strikes and fuel shortages are drawing attention? One answer is that Putin may believe conceding under visible pressure would project weakness. Another is that he may judge Russia's long-range strike advantage to be more valuable than the relief a mutual halt would bring. A third is that he may expect Ukraine's deep strike campaign to continue evolving, and therefore wants no formal limits that could later constrain Russian retaliation. Each of these possibilities points to the same conclusion. Moscow is not yet at a point where it sees restraint as strategically beneficial. The rejection is evidence of that judgment. The visual logic of the topic also helps explain its medium viral potential. It is not as universally immediate as a direct civilian casualty event because part of it involves diplomatic language and strategic reasoning rather than one devastating image. At the same time, it is more gripping than a routine peace talks update because it connects politics directly to missiles, drones, oil fires, and the future scale of the war. Viewers understand what it means when strikes on cities and refineries are allowed to continue. They understand what it means when a leader dismisses a limit on such attacks. That gives the story enough tension and consequence to perform strongly, especially when paired with evidence of current strikes and current energy disruptions. This topic also benefits from having two clear audiences at once. One audience is interested in hard geopolitics and negotiation signals. For them, the line that Russia's conditions have not changed since 2024 is the key development. The second audience is interested in military escalation and the practical danger of drones and missiles. For them, the rejection of a halt on long-range strikes is the key development. Because both readings lead back to the same event, the story can hold different kinds of attention without becoming fragmented. That is a major advantage in long-form video, where retention depends on being able to serve both headline interest and deeper strategic explanation. Another reason the topic holds is that it reveals the structure of the current war more clearly than many daily updates do. The war is no longer only about frontline advances and retreats. It is also about resource denial, infrastructure vulnerability, strategic messaging, industrial resilience, and the use of long-range systems to pressure the opponent's society. Putin's rejection of limits on long-range strikes concentrates all of those themes in one decision. It tells us that Russia still sees deep strikes as useful. It tells us that Ukraine's own deep strikes are painful enough to be publicly discussed by the Kremlin. It tells us that diplomacy has not found even a narrow confidence-building measure that both sides can accept. That is why this single issue says so much about the broader phase of the conflict. The final point is that this story does not end with the rejection itself. The rejection sets conditions for what may follow. More refinery strikes inside Russia remain possible. More Russian missile and drone attacks on Ukrainian cities remain possible. More political efforts to frame the opponent as desperate, weak, or unreasonable remain likely. And because the Kremlin says its peace conditions remain unchanged, each new escalation will be read through the same unresolved dispute over territory and sovereignty. That is the real significance of the event. Putin did not just reject a pause in a category of attacks. He signaled that one of the war's most dangerous patterns is staying in place. Another important layer in this story is that Russia has made similar arguments before, which means the June 29th rejection fits an established pattern rather than a sudden shift. Al Jazeera noted that in September 2024, Putin warned that if Western nations allowed Ukraine to use their long-range weapons to strike inside Russia, then it would signal that NATO was also at war with his country. He said at the time, this would in a significant way change the very nature of the conflict. It would mean that NATO countries, the US, European countries, are at war with Russia. That warning matters because it shows how long-range weapons have occupied a special place in Moscow's rhetoric for almost 2 years. They are not treated as ordinary battlefield tools. They are treated as instruments that can change the political meaning of the war itself. But the later record also matters. Al Jazeera reported that in November 2024, Kyiv was given the green light from the US and NATO to start firing long-range missiles provided by countries like the United Kingdom, France, and the United States into Russian territory. The same report noted that this shift came as Moscow intensified its attacks on Kyiv and after the deployment of North Korean troops in Russia's Kursk region, which had earlier been entered by Ukrainian forces. This sequence is important because it undercuts any simple idea that the long-range issue emerged overnight. It has been building in stages. Russia warned against it. Western support for Ukrainian long-range use still expanded. Ukraine then integrated that tool into a broader campaign against Russian infrastructure. By June 29, 2026, the issue had become one of the war's defining fault lines. The report also highlighted a contradiction in Russia's own argument. Despite Kyiv using long-range missiles after the Western green light, Russia did not declare war on NATO. That matters because it shows the difference between rhetorical escalation and actual policy. Moscow described Western-backed long-range strikes as a major red line, yet the war continued within the same broad frame rather than transforming into a formal Russia-NATO war. This matters for the current story because it suggests the Kremlin adapts to realities it publicly condemns, provided it believes it can still compete effectively inside them. That logic may help explain the June 29th rejection as well. Rather than seeking to remove the long-range domain entirely, Moscow may prefer to keep operating in it because it still believes it can impose more damage than it absorbs. The role of European diplomacy also sheds light on why this remains such a contentious issue. Al Jazeera reported that in May, the leaders of the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and Poland met Zelenskyy in Kyiv in a show of unity a day after Putin hosted allies at a Victory Day parade in Red Square. The article added that Putin strongly objected to European leaders taking part in truce efforts. He asked, how can the EU or individual EU countries serve as mediators when they are directly assisting the country with which we are in an armed conflict? That quote is important because it shows how Moscow is narrowing the list of actors it considers acceptable in mediation roles. If Europe is treated as too involved to mediate, and Ukraine refuses territorial concessions, and Russia refuses to limit long-range strikes, then the space for even a partial diplomatic breakthrough becomes extremely narrow. There is also a direct connection between the long-range strikes debate and the problem of military production. If Russia believes it can outproduce or outlast Ukraine in the long-range contest, then every month of continued strikes favors Moscow's theory of attrition. If Ukraine believes deep attacks on refineries, fuel chains, and electricity facilities can offset some of Russia's larger military mass, then every month of continued strikes gives Kyiv another chance to erode the machinery behind Russian operations. Under that logic, a mutual halt becomes harder to sell because each side thinks the future may validate its method. The June 29th story also works because it sits at the intersection of battlefield logic and political theater. Putin's remarks were not delivered in a vacuum. They were made after visible Ukrainian strikes, after acknowledged fuel shortages, and during a period when peace efforts had already failed to produce a breakthrough. Every sentence therefore served two audiences. One was the foreign audience trying to read Russia's next move. The other was the domestic audience inside Russia that needed to hear that the Kremlin was not backing down under pressure. When Putin says Russia's counterstrikes are stronger and more destructive, he is not only explaining a military calculation, he is also reinforcing an image of resilience and superiority to audiences that matter politically. For Ukraine and its partners, the message is equally clear. If Moscow rejects limits on long-range strikes now, then any protection for Ukrainian rear cities will have to come primarily from stronger air defense and better interception, rather than from negotiated restraint. That is why the long-range debate links directly back to the same-day Ukrainian appeals for more anti-ballistic and air defense capabilities. The diplomatic file and the military procurement file are no longer separate. Every failed effort to narrow the strike war increases the importance of radars, interceptors, launchers, hardened infrastructure, and domestic production capacity. In practical terms, Russia's rejection of one proposed limit creates more urgency in another area entirely, the race to defend against the next wave. Taken together, the facts form a clear narrative. The Kremlin publicly said its peace terms were unchanged since 2024. Putin said Ukraine proposed a mutual halt to long-range strikes. He rejected that proposal. He argued that Russian deep strikes are stronger and more destructive, and he framed Ukraine's request as a sign of weakness. Ukraine, meanwhile, continued long-range attacks on Russian oil infrastructure that Moscow admits have caused fuel shortages. Analysts say Russia has greater long-range strike capacity and wants to preserve that edge. Peace talks remain stalled over territory and NATO. Civilian casualties in Ukraine continue to mount under ongoing Russian strikes. Every part of that chain points in the same direction. The war's long-range dimension is not narrowing, it is becoming more central. Under current conditions, Moscow appears determined to keep it that way for now.